It's 1943. The Pacific skies roar with thunder. American pilots fly missions that stretch the limits of both man and machine. High above the Solomon Islands, the sun burns through the clouds like molten glass, and below, the ocean mirrors the chaos of war. The P-38 Lightning, America's twin-engine marvel, cuts through the air, elegant, fast, and deadly. But in those early months, it carried a hidden flaw, a flaw that would turn its greatest strength into a deadly trap. In dives, the aircraft would shake violently, controls locking, the nose refusing to rise. Many pilots never came home. Their planes vanished into the waves below, swallowed by silence. Then, one mechanic, a quiet, grease-covered man working in a remote island hangar, refused to accept it. He wasn't a general, not even an engineer, just a field mechanic with a stubborn heart and a dangerous idea. Late at night, under the hum of oil lamps and the distant echo of bombers, he began experimenting, with nothing but wire, pliers, and instinct. What he discovered wasn't in any manual. It was pure madness or genius. A crazy fix, so simple, so reckless, it shouldn't have worked. But it did. And that small act, that midnight spark of desperation, would change air combat forever. It was the spring of 1943, somewhere in the South Pacific. A place that smelled of salt fuel and fear. The war had turned the islands into stepping stones of smoke and steel, and each sunrise came wrapped in the sound of engines winding up for another day of combat. The airfields were muddy scars carved into jungle hillsides, where men worked without sleep and machines came in broken, burning, or both. Every day the ground crews patched up what the sky had tried to destroy. Every night they listened for the faint drone of returning aircraft, praying that familiar sounds wouldn't end in silence. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was America's shining sword in that brutal theater. With its twin booms, sleek shape, and long legs, it looked like something born from the future. Pilots loved its power, its speed, its climb. It could outfly most anything the Japanese sent up, except when it didn't, because hidden beneath all that brilliance was a deadly flaw that no one fully understood. When the P-38 dove, sometimes it wouldn't pull out. The stick froze, the controls locked. The aircraft plunged like a stone, and in those seconds no amount of strength, training, or prayer could bring it back. Men went down screaming, and nobody could explain why. They called it compressibility, a mysterious aerodynamic effect that seemed to mock every rule they'd learned. Scientists back home in California scratched their heads. Pilots in the field cursed under their breath. Mechanics swore it was a cable issue. Others said it was the airframe. But whatever it was killing them, and fast. In the islands, news of these accidents spread like wildfire. The mess tents fell silent whenever a plane failed to return. Pilots stopped joking about near misses. They started whispering instead, in that quiet, uneasy way soldiers do when courage has to live beside fear. Each time the engines roared to life for another mission. They glanced at their P-30As a little differently, like men shaking hands with something that might betray them. Among them was a crew chief, a young mechanic whose name history would never record. He wasn't a decorated pilot or a brilliant engineer. He was just one of thousands of men who lived ankle-deep in mud, with oil under their fingernails and sweat on their backs. But he noticed things others didn't. Every time a plane came in, trembling from a dive, he felt the control surfaces, checked the tension in the cables, listened to the creak of the metal cooling down after flight. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones. The official manuals gave no answers. The officers above him didn't care for speculation. Their orders were simple: repair, refuel, return to duty. But this mechanic couldn't stop thinking about the pilots who'd vanished, their call signs still painted on lockers and toolboxes. He'd helped them strap in, waved them off, watched their planes vanish into the clouds, and they'd never come back. Maybe, he thought, if he could find what everyone else had missed, he could keep the next one alive. So he started watching. Late into the nights, when the others were asleep, he'd linger in the hangar, flashlight in hand, staring at the control systems of grounded P-30As. He'd trace the cables with his fingers, feeling their play, their tension, their slight vibration. And then he noticed it. Something subtle, under high stress, especially after sharp dives. The control cables would shift, just enough to alter their alignment. It wasn't much, just a fraction of movement. But in the delicate world of flight, that fraction could mean death. He thought about it for hours. The next morning, when the first light hit the runway and the mechanics dragged themselves from their bunks, he went scavenging. In the corner of the hangar, there was a pile of discarded materials, old safety wire, broken clamps, bits of metal tubing. He picked through it quietly, ignoring the puzzled looks from his friends. "You building a plane of your own?" One of them joked. He didn't answer. He was too busy forming an idea in his head, a wild, impossible idea. He found what he needed: a length of steel wire, thin but strong, and a pair of pliers. That was all. With these two tools, he crawled beneath the control surfaces of the P-38 and began to work. His hands moved with the confidence of habit, looping, twisting, tightening. He was creating tension braces, hand-made supports to reinforce the cable paths. To the untrained eye, it looked like nonsense, just messy wire work. But to him, it was a way to stop the cables from flexing when the plane dove, a small act of defiance against physics itself. By midday, sweat rolled down his arms and grease blackened his shirt. Other crewmen laughed as they walked by. "That's some crazy rigging you've got there," one said. The mechanic only smiled faintly. Maybe it was crazy. Maybe he'd just ruined a perfectly good aircraft, but something in his gut told him to trust it. When the pilot arrived for his next mission, the mechanic hesitated before saying anything. He didn't want to admit what he'd done. Not yet. The pilot noticed the extra wiring but shrugged. "As long as she flies," he said. The engine started, twin Allisons roaring like thunder, and the P-38 taxied out to the runway. The mechanic watched it rise into the sky, heart pounding. Minutes passed, then an hour, then two. Finally, a familiar shape appeared on the horizon, descending smoothly through the clouds. The plane touched down gently, taxied to a stop, and the canopy slid open. The pilot climbed out, pulled off his helmet, and shouted something the whole hangar could hear. "She held steady!" That moment changed everything. Word spread faster than wildfire. Pilots began asking what had been done. The crazy fix became legend. Other squadrons copied it. Soon, field mechanics across the Pacific were using wire and pliers to reinforce their lightnings. What had started as an act of desperation turned into standard procedure. Even Lockheed engineers, months later, acknowledged that the field modification worked, the first real step toward solving the P-38's deadly dive problem. The war rolled on. Battles came and went. The Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines. And the lightning soared through all of them. Its pilots began to regain confidence, flying harder, faster, higher. They broke records. They shot down zeros by the dozens. The aircraft that had once terrified its own pilots became one of the most feared fighters in the Pacific. And somewhere, far from the glory and headlines, that mechanic kept working in silence. He never wrote reports, never claimed credit. When asked how he'd figured it out, he just said, "It made sense at the time." Maybe that was all there was to it. A man trusting his eyes, his hands, and his instincts. The truth is, history rarely remembers the ones who fix things quietly. Their names aren't carved in marble or printed in books. But their fingerprints live in the steel and rivets of the machines they touched. In every flight that ended safely, in every man who made it home because of a piece of wire twisted in the dark. Years later, when engineers perfected dive recovery flaps and aerodynamic fixes, they built on what that nameless mechanic had started. They gave it proper science, equations, and designs. But the heart of it, the raw, human part, had already been proven under lamplight and oil fumes on a faraway island. War is remembered for its noise, the bombs, the engines, the victory parades. But it's built on moments of silence, the kind where one man looks at a problem and refuses to walk away. That night in 1943, when a single mechanic dared to twist a piece of wire and hope against all odds, he did more than fix a plane. He changed the way men would fight, fly, and survive. He never got a medal, never heard his name in any briefing. But every time a P-38 dove and came back in one piece, every time a pilot stepped onto the tarmac and smiled with relief, that was his victory. A quiet, unspoken triumph written not in headlines but in the sky. And maybe that's how history really works. Not through orders shouted from above, but through the whispers of those who dare to think differently. The ones who believe that even in the darkest moments, a single, crazy idea can save lives and shape the future. He worked alone that night, long after the rest of the maintenance crew had gone to their bunks. The air outside the hangar was heavy with tropical humidity, thick enough to cling to the skin. The jungle beyond was alive with the low hum of insects and the distant rumble of thunder. The same kind of thunder that would soon echo from engines in the sky. But inside that corrugated metal hangar, beneath a single swinging lamp, one man was at war with something invisible. He'd spent weeks studying every inch of the P-38 Lightning's control system, trying to understand why the aircraft, that was supposed to be the pride of American engineering, was killing its own pilots. Others had blamed the thin air at high altitude, or pilot error, or even the metal fatigue caused by humidity and salt. But he didn't buy any of it. He trusted what he could see and touch. The cables that linked the pilot's hands to the control surfaces, the pulleys that strained under load, the vibration that rippled through the fuselage after every dive. He'd seen the same story too many times. A pilot dives after a Japanese Zero, pushing the throttles forward until the engines howl. The nose drops, the altimeter spins, and suddenly, nothing. The stick freezes, the aircraft refuses to respond, and in the next heartbeat, the sky turns into a coffin. When the wreckage was found, the controls were always intact. No snapped cables, no broken parts. The failure wasn't mechanical. It was something deeper, something born in the strange, merciless language of aerodynamics. But to this mechanic, science wasn't the only answer. He believed that sometimes, even the smallest imperfection, a bit of slack, a vibration, a subtle flex, could cascade into disaster when pushed to the limit. So he looked closer, and what he saw was that, during high-speed dives, the control cables that ran through the tail would tremble like strings on a guitar. They were vibrating under immense aerodynamic load, and those micro-movements were just enough to disrupt the balance of the elevator system. If he could stop that vibration, maybe, just maybe, the pilots could pull out again. He took a step back and rubbed the grease from his fingers onto a rag, staring at the silver ghost of the P-38 in the lamplight. The aircraft looked almost alive, sleek, dangerous, wounded. It deserved better than to be feared by its own crew. He reached into his toolbox and found a roll of safety wire, thin and flexible, the kind used for securing bolts and fasteners. Nothing fancy, nothing official. Just a roll of wire and a pair of pliers. He crouched under the tail and began threading the wire around the control cable housings, weaving a lattice of tension braces. He wasn't following any schematic. This was all instinct, guided by the rhythm of his hands and the quiet hum of his mind. Twist, pull, tighten. He could feel the difference as he worked. The cables no longer shifted freely. They stayed taut, controlled, disciplined. It was crude, yes, but elegant in its own way. Hours passed. The night deepened. Sweat dripped from his forehead and fell onto the metal below, mixing with oil and dust. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping against the hangar roof in a steady rhythm. When he finally stood up, his knees ached and his hands were raw. But the modification was done. He looked at it, the strange web of wire gleaming faintly in the light. And for a long time, he didn't know whether to laugh or curse himself. It was a stupid idea, a dangerous one. The officers would never approve. If he was wrong, he'd not only ruin the plane, but might kill the next pilot who flew it. But something deep inside told him it was right. There was logic in its simplicity. He cleaned up his tools, stepped outside, and let the rain wash the grease from his arms. The jungle smelled alive again. Maybe it was the scent of rain, or maybe, just maybe, it was hope. The next morning, as the squadron prepared for another mission, the mechanic approached the pilot assigned to that particular aircraft. The man was young, confident, and already halfway into his pre-flight checks when he noticed the modification. "What the hell's this?" he asked, tapping the wire with his glove. "Just something I've been trying," the mechanic said carefully. "Might help with the dive problem." The pilot gave him a skeptical look. "You tested it?" "Not yet." The pilot frowned. "Then I'll test it." He climbed into the cockpit, strapped himself in, and fired up the twin Allison engines. They roared to life, echoing across the field. The mechanic stepped back, shielding his face from the prop wash. His stomach twisted into knots as the plane rolled toward the runway. He watched it lift off, the silver wings flashing in the sunlight. And for a moment, it was just another day in the war. But as the P-38 climbed higher, the tension in his chest grew heavier. He couldn't look away. The plane climbed, leveled off, then tilted into a steep dive. The sound of its engines deepened as it picked up speed. He could almost feel the pressure in his own bones, the rush of air against the wings, the moment when, in every other case, control would be lost. But this time something was different. At the bottom of the dive, the aircraft steadied. The nose lifted smoothly. The engines didn't wail, they purred. The pilot pulled out clean, no shudder, no loss of control. It was like watching a ghost reborn. The P-38 circled once, twice, then lined up for landing. When it touched down, the pilot didn't even wait for the propellers to stop spinning. He jumped out, tore off his helmet, and shouted across the hangar. "She held steady, all the way down!" The mechanic froze. For a heartbeat, he didn't believe it. Then it hit him all at once. the rush of adrenaline, the disbelief, the raw joy. He felt like laughing and crying at the same time. The other mechanics ran over, swarming around the plane, asking what had changed. When they saw the wire lattice under the control cables, they laughed. "You're kidding," one said. "You fixed a dive problem with safety wire." The mechanic just smiled. "Looks that way." From that day on, everything changed. Pilots who had once refused to dive their P-38s now pushed them harder, trusting that they'd come back up. Word spread from island to island, squadron to squadron. Soon mechanics everywhere were copying the crazy wire trick. It wasn't official. There were no blueprints, no orders, no technical bulletins. Just word of mouth, passed through the ranks like a secret. When engineers at Lockheed heard about it months later, they were stunned. They ran tests, analyzed the modifications, and confirmed what the field crews already knew. The tension created by the wire bracing reduced control vibration and improved stability at high speeds. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough to give pilots a fighting chance until the factory designed a permanent fix. The man who'd started it all never asked for recognition. He didn't see himself as a hero. For him, it was just another night's work. Another problem that needed solving before the next mission. But his crazy fix did something no weapon or strategy ever could. It restored faith. Pilots began to trust their planes again. They flew lower, faster, bolder. The P-38's reputation transformed almost overnight. What had been a source of dread became a symbol of reliability. It's strange, the way history remembers heroes. The pilots who shot down enemy aces became legends. The generals who commanded them became names in textbooks. But the mechanic, the man who changed everything with a roll of wire and 2 hands, remained invisible. His story lived only in whispers and small talk between veterans who remembered the war not from the skies, but from the ground. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit alone outside the hangar, watching the silhouettes of the P-38s lined up against the moonlight. Each one carried a piece of him. His labor, his sweat, his defiance. And though he'd never admit it out loud, he knew what he'd done mattered. Somewhere above those clouds, men were alive because of his hands. He didn't keep a diary. He didn't write letters home about it. Maybe he understood something simple, that in war, the victories that matter most aren't the ones the newspapers write about. They're the quiet ones, built in the dark, by those who never expect thanks. Weeks later, one of the squadron's senior officers visited the hangar. He'd heard about the modification and wanted to see it himself. The mechanic demonstrated, explaining the tension principle, showing how the wire prevented micro vibrations. The officer nodded slowly. "You know," he said, "you may have just saved a lot of good men." The mechanic shrugged. "Just did what made sense, sir." The officer smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes." The crazy fix soon became part of the P-38's lore, the kind of story told in half, whispers around campfires, or years later in bars where veterans gathered to remember. They'd laugh about the mad genius with the pliers, the man who tied wires to an airplane and saved lives. But behind the laughter, there was respect, the kind reserved for those who quietly do the impossible. And maybe that's what makes his story timeless. Not because it's about war, or airplanes, or heroism, but because it's about that one thing that defines every act of human courage, the refusal to give up when everyone else has. That night, when he first picked up the wire and pliers, he didn't know he was rewriting a piece of history. He just wanted to keep someone alive. The war went on day after day, sky after sky, but something was different now. The P-38 Lightning, once feared as much by its pilots as by its enemies, had found its rhythm. It was faster, sharper, deadlier, and most importantly, trusted. Pilots dove into battles with confidence they hadn't felt in months, knowing that when the world blurred into streaks of blue and white, when the stick trembled under their palms, they could pull back, and the aircraft would obey. That single, improvised fix had turned uncertainty into precision. The crazy wire trick wasn't elegant, wasn't official, and certainly wasn't the kind of solution anyone in a lab would have approved. But out here, in the wet heat of the Pacific, where life and death depended on the difference between almost and enough, it was perfect. The line between chaos and control was now held by a few strands of steel wire, twisted, tightened, and trusted. Within weeks, the results became impossible to ignore. Missions that used to end in tragedy now came home with full formations. The hangars that once buzzed with whispers of fear now rang with laughter, music, and the clang of wrenches. Pilots would pat their planes before takeoff, a small gesture of gratitude, not just for the machine, but for the unknown hands that had made it safe. The P-38 began to carve its name into history. Over the jungles of New Guinea, over the blue expanse of the Bismarck Sea, through clouds thick with tracer fire, its twin engines became the heartbeat of the Allied advance. It escorted bombers deeper than any other fighter could reach. It hunted enemy planes across islands and oceans, and in every battle, that small piece of wire, the silent guardian hidden in its control system, played its part. No one ever wrote reports about it. No one pinned medals for it. But the effect was undeniable. The P-38's reputation transformed almost overnight. It was no longer a machine to fear, but a weapon of unmatched reliability. Pilots called it the fork-tailed devil, a name whispered by both sides, one with admiration, the other with dread. Every flight carried a legacy. Every mission was proof that a single idea, born in the shadows of a forgotten hangar, could ripple through the sky and change the outcome of a war. The Lightning's success wasn't just measured in enemy aircraft destroyed or bombers protected. It was measured in the lives that returned home. The mechanic, of course, never saw any of that glory. His war remained on the ground. Long nights spent under humming lights, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, patching bullet holes with sheets of aluminum. But sometimes, as he looked up from his work, he'd see a formation of P-38s returning at dusk, their engines glowing faint orange against the horizon. He'd stop and watch until they disappeared, a faint smile forming beneath his weary eyes. He didn't need recognition. The fact that they came back was enough. For every pilot who landed safely, there was an invisible bond connecting them back to that one mechanic and his crazy fix. And though no one said it out loud, the pilots knew. They might not know his name, but they understood that somewhere, someone had cared enough to find an answer when everyone else gave up. As the war dragged on, new technologies emerged. Engineers in California developed aerodynamic solutions, dive recovery flaps, redesigned tail surfaces, better hydraulics, all rooted in the same problem that a field mechanic had once solved with nothing but wire and willpower. The official records would later show the improvements, the test data, the patents. But buried deep within those advancements was a piece of unspoken truth. Before the scientists, before the laboratories, before the official fixes, There had been a single act of human improvisation. The legacy of that fix wasn't just technical, it was spiritual. It reminded everyone that ingenuity could come from anywhere, that sometimes the line between genius and madness was drawn by courage, that mechanics' work became a symbol of something far greater than engineering. It was a reminder that even in the bloodiest chapters of history, creativity and humanity could still shine through the smoke. The war eventually began to tilt in favor of the Allies. The skies that once belonged to the Japanese began to clear. The P-38s escorted bombers all the way to the Philippines, shredded enemy formations over the Pacific, and carried American pilots deeper into enemy territory than ever before. Some even took part in the daring mission to intercept and kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. A mission that forever changed the course of the war. That victory, historians would later say, was made possible by the P-38's unique range and reliability. But few would ever know that the aircraft's reliability, the thing that allowed it to dive fast, strike hard, and return safely, had begun with a nameless mechanic's idea, improvised under a flickering lamp on a humid night. When the war ended, the pilots went home to parades, medals, and family embraces. The mechanics packed their tools and left the islands behind, their uniforms faded, their hands calloused. The hangars emptied, the airfields turned to dust, and the jungle slowly reclaimed the scars of war. But somewhere out there, in the wreckage of history, a few P-38s still bore his mark. Bits of wire twisted neatly around their control systems, rusted now, but still holding. In time, the story faded into obscurity. It was never written down, it never made the official reports. But among those who remembered, the few pilots who had flown those early, deadly dives, it became legend. They would tell it in bars decades later, to their children, to anyone who would listen. We had this mechanic, crazy as hell, fixed the dive problem with a bit of wire, saved half the squadron, and though the details changed with every telling, the essence never did. That one man, armed with nothing but determination, had changed the fate of a machine and the lives of those who flew it. Years later, historians would look at the P-38's performance records and see only numbers, top speed, altitude, kill ratios. They'd write about its aces, its battles, its victories. But they'd miss the human heartbeat hidden inside those statistics. The pulse of one man's courage to try something everyone else dismissed as madness. Because wars, for all their grand strategies and famous names, are built on moments like his. Small, invisible acts that never make the headlines. Quiet revolutions forged in sweat, not speeches. Somewhere in a forgotten corner of a museum or airbase restoration project, an old P-38 might still carry traces of that original modification. Maybe a section of reinforced cable, maybe the faint twist of safety wire where no one expected it. And maybe, just maybe, that's how his story continues, not as words on a plaque, but as something tangible, something real, buried inside the skin of the aircraft that outlived him. It's easy to forget that history isn't written in ink. It's written in fingerprints, in dents, in the hidden marks left by those who refused to let things stay broken. That mechanic's hands left marks like that, invisible to most, but eternal to those who know where to look. When the world remembers the P-38 Lightning, it remembers a legend, the twin-engine fighter that could outclimb, outshoot, and outrun its enemies. But inside that legend lives a smaller story, one that doesn't roar like engines or glitter like medals. It hums softly, like a tensioned wire under lamplight, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things hold the greatest power. And so, the legacy of that crazy fix became something larger than war. It became a testament to what defines humanity, even in its darkest hour, the drive to create, to adapt, to survive. Because somewhere between the fear of failure and the hope of success, there exists a moment where courage takes form, sometimes as a weapon, sometimes as an idea, and sometimes as a piece of wire twisted by tired hands under the glow of a single light. The Pacific skies grew quiet long ago. The hangars stand empty now, their doors rusted, their floors littered with the ghosts of tools once used to hold the world together. But if you listen closely, maybe you can still hear it. The faint echo of a wrench falling, the hum of a working engine, the whisper of a man's voice saying, "She'll fly now." That voice, though long gone, still speaks in every act of quiet ingenuity that follows. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are not won with force or power, but with patience, vision, and the courage to try something new, even when the world calls it crazy. And that, perhaps, is the truest measure of legacy. Not how loudly it's remembered, but how deeply it endures, carried on the wind, in the sky, in the machines that were once broken, and in the men who dared to fix them.